Welcome Ghana, we did for you. Welcome's got it all for me and you. Sizzling discounts, we take up by a distance. Bring back home the experience we did for you. Life made so easy, peasy, lemon squeezy, shopping made easy. Sometimes money day, sometimes some way out of pocket. We got you everywhere, everything, we got it all right here. Welcome season. The price is right.
The price is right.
The price is nice.
The price is nice.
Fresh with the vibes, unbeatable. If the price they fight,
If the price they fight,
come for the views,
come for the views,
come for the likes,
come for the likes.
everything you they want under one roof. Even come for the ride.
Oh, yeah, come for the ride.
Number one stop shop, number one. Your number one stop shop, Melcom. Your number one stop shop, number one. Your number one stop shop, Melcom. Melcom Ghana, we did for you. Melcom's got it all for me and you.
No matter the generation you belong to, Melcom is where Ghana shops.
Bring back home the experience we did for you.
Bring home the experience.
Abebe Selassie is the director of the African Department, a position he has held since 2016. In this capacity, he oversees the IMF's work with 45 countries across sub-Saharan Africa. Abebe and his team work closely with the region's leaders and policymakers to improve economic and development outcomes. This includes oversight of the IMF's intensified engagement with the region in recent years, including some $60 billion in financial support the institution has provided to countries since 2020. Before being appointed director in 2016, Mr. Selassie gained extensive experience in a wide-ranging career at the IMF. He held various senior positions, including deputy director in the African Department, mission chief for Portugal during the Euro area crisis, and South Africa. He has served as the IMF senior resident representative in Uganda, and earlier in his career, he worked on the fund's lending programs with Turkey, Thailand, Romania, and Estonia. While in the Strategy, Policy and Review Department, he was deeply involved in the IMF program and adjustment policy design issues. Before joining the IMF in 1994, he worked for the government of Ethiopia as a principal economist in the Office of the President and at the Economist Intelligence Unit in London. Abebe did his graduate studies at the London School of Economics.
So the man has been working with the IMF for 32 years and we're happy to talk to him. Abebe, thank you so much.
Thank you, Bernard. Thank you for having me.
So this is 94 since you joined the fund?
Yes, late 94.
Wow, so how many times would you have come to Ghana within that period?
You know, I don't know, total maybe about 8, 9 times, maybe a bit more. I've never really worked with the Ghana country team directly, but over the years I've had incredible opportunity to come here, including starting before I joined the IMF. I was working for my government.
Okay.
So I think maybe 92, late 92, 90, and
Wow.
I think most likely 93. I came to study a little bit how your reforms in the FX market had proceeded and to try and adapt lessons.
Even then?
Back then.
Wow.
So really, so I have, you know, these data points, you know, from the early 90s, having been here, also of course Addis and Kampala and Harare.
And it's been 10 years in this role.
Yes, as director of the African Department of the IMF.
What does that actually entail?
So, you know, what basically that means is that I have the great privilege of working with the 45 countries in sub-Saharan Africa. We provide support to countries and basically through three different ways. First and foremost, of course, and one which doesn't get a lot of limelight, honestly, is capacity development. So we do a lot of technical work across the region where we provide input into governments' deliberations and preparation of policies. So, you know, this is stuff that never sees the light of day. But, you know, for example, you know, with central banks, we help work with them in terms of how to deepen monetary money markets, how to make sure that FX markets function better, with tax authorities. What is the optimal way of setting up your tax collection framework? What are the kind of optimal policies? And we do all of this by bringing experts and explaining what works best, what has worked best for other similarly situated countries or more advanced countries. So a lot of capacity building in this vein. So that's the first avenue. Second is we have something called kind of surveillance discussions around the world. An important mandate of the IMF is to make sure that the direction of policies in all countries around the world is one which is doesn't lead to spillovers, to externalities, as we would call them, that have a negative impact on other countries, that the direction of policies are broadly the right one. So we have those kind of discussions with all 45 members of the IMF from Sub-Saharan Africa. And then the last but not least is that we, of course, provide financing when countries are in severe difficulty, whether it's in the context of shocks or the periods where there are macroeconomic imbalances. That is the one that's
that's what we talk about a lot more.
Yeah, exactly. That's what captures the public's imagination.
Yeah.
And that's also a really incredibly important way in which we try and provide support for countries.
A lot of the conversation will be focused on that. But I'm intrigued by the second point around the surveillance and the policy spillovers, because one would think that a lot of the countries in SSA are too small to really have a dent on the global economy, and that type of thing needs to happen with the bigger countries. Because
we do.
So you do work in these countries too?
Yeah, no. So this surveillance work that we do is all 191 members of the IMF, and that is actually, I would say, kind of the lion's share of the IMF's time is both on bilateral, the institution with the countries and reporting on that to the rest of the world, but also multilateral surveillance. So I would argue that we are the premier institution.
But is that work
in terms of assessing how, in aggregate, the global economy is functioning, where the pressure points are, what can be done best by countries to make sure that those pressure points are alleviated, all with a view to making sure that you have better global growth, higher quality global growth that is beneficial to
But is that citizens. Work in the global context diagnostic or prescriptive?
Both, I would say.
So you're able to say, for example, that trade war is not good for the world, therefore don't do it.
Right? I mean,
would they listen to you?
I think you underestimate we have, one of the great things about our institution is we have really great convening power. I would argue that, in many of the important issues of the day, global imbalances, for example, AI, what effect it could have on labor force issues, dynamics going forward. These are all kind of things that we weigh in on. We have leading experts on this, and also ministers come, finance ministers, twice a year in Washington at the spring meetings, at the annual meetings, and fairly intense discussions are had. We provide extensive support to other global configurations, G20, G7. We provide input into their deliberations, particularly in this area of global cooperation, fiscal policy, of monetary policy, and we have, again, also kind of all other kinds of fora with whom we used to meet with central bankers and others. And I think leaders across the world value the fact that they can sit with their peer groups and discuss some of these issues. Resolution is not always easy, but at least, discussions, we facilitate a lot of discussions and put forward a lot of ideas.
This conversation is happening within a very interesting context. Yesterday, the Canadian Prime Minister spoke at the World Economic Forum. He says, we have to be honest. The rule-based order we've assumed is now fiction. There's a new reality. And he described his country as a middle power that needs to form new alliances. There are two questions in there. How seriously dented is what we know? Is it in transition, or it's basically ended? And number two, what does that mean for the relevance of multilateral institutions like yours? Because of course there's a UN, the WTO, but I think the World Bank and the IMF are also extensions of that. So it's a two-in-one.
Okay, so yeah, big questions that we could go on.
Of course, he's a central banker
and
himself as well. So don't forget that. He was speaking as a former central banker and now Canadian Prime Minister.
Okay. So, just I want to perhaps relate these questions to how it impacts sub-Saharan Africa, or like
course.
at least the perspective I see it in. So I think the first thing to note is, yes, absolutely, this is a period of great disruption, great change, and we have to, accept that it's happening. And so at the same time, I think it's important to contextualize. Contextualize in what way? It's not as if the global economy or my institution has not gone through periods of huge changes, seismic changes even. Some are related to crises, global financial crises. For example, COVID, of course, crisis that we're just coming through. Those also had huge consequences in terms of well-being of people, the global configurations. But also like in a historical context, for example, coming to the IMF, until we only became a universal membership organization after the fall of the Iron Curtain. Before that, all of the countries in the Soviet Union bloc were not even members of the IMF. China's membership to the IMF only happened in the 1980s. So, I think we also have to accept that, over a period, longer term periods, there have been these periods of rapture and reconfiguration and adaptability by international organizations to play a role that global governments are asking. Now, drilling down a bit further, for African countries, I think what is happening around the world at some level is also not new. I think the positioning of many of our countries has always been, as part of what in the old days we used to call the non-aligned movement. I think the lion's share of our countries were seeing that it was important to have multiple trade partners, multiple allies, and have stuck with that approach. So I think that I see needing to continue to persist. So there's been both diversification of financial relationships, trade relationships that Africa has had. We used to be with Europe, we used to, a lot more. Now it's as much with China, other Asian countries, emerging powers in the Middle East, etc. And so I think most of our countries are relatively well positioned by having a diverse set of partners. And I think this needs to be maintained going forward. So I think there's also some strength in or some positioning that has happened by our countries that is probably somewhat less challenging than for other countries that are only now beginning to face it. When it comes to international organizations, as I said, I think there's a couple of things. I mean, one is that it's not as if the IMF has its we are a membership organization, so the work we do, the mandate that we have, comes from all of our members, 191 members. There have been periods where, of course, countries have been looking inwards to address things, not enough mindful of the fact that what they are doing is not helping global well-being. So that's exactly, and in fact, it's this 1930s period of global depression, bigger than ever devaluations, which gave rise to the need for institutions like the Bretton Woods institutions, IMF and World Bank. And I think over the years, that system has also not been stable. It's been changing over time. So there was a big change, for example, in the late 60s, early 70s, when countries came off the dollar peg. It led to a whole rewiring of how monetary and fiscal policies are conducted. We got new mandates, new responsibilities. We stepped up to that. So we are an institution that will always be there to help countries to do what countries ask us to do. And so in that vein, I think one thing I can certainly say is that, the need for entities that facilitate the conversations we're talking about, if anything, is greater now than ever.
This is the point of view. We're speaking to the Director for Africa for IMF, Abebe Aemro Selassie. He's been with the fund for many years. He's done this job in this role for 10 years, and in May, he will hang up his boots. Reflections on many things. So 10 years overseeing the fund's work in over 42, 43, 44 countries. A couple of points there. How would you know if you've done well? Let me give the context for this. I was reading the Global Economic Prospects Report, World Bank Group. I think this is 23, 24. Global growth has unmistakably slowed down and has unmistakably downshifted to a slower gear since the pandemic. It's now at a pace insufficient to reduce extreme poverty and create jobs where they are needed most. If the forecast in the latest edition of the World Bank Group's Global Economic Prospects materialize, the average growth rate of this decade will be the lowest since the 1960s. It goes on. That depressing statistic hides an even more disconcerting detail. While nearly all advanced economies will be richer in per capita income than they were before the pandemic, 1 out of 4 developing countries and more than a third of all low-income economies will be poorer than they were 5 years ago. This is absolutely damning. How do you interpret such a report in view of the fact that of the work you've been trying to do in these countries over the past 10 years?
So, I think the first point to make is that there is more heterogeneity, there's more differentiation in terms of economic trajectories in Africa than probably around the world. Second, one thing that I've been at pains to draw attention to is the fact that you have this very, very diverse set of countries in the region and diverse economic developments across the region, and I really always kind of worry when we are trying to lump a continent as diverse as this into a single data point, a single figure. Okay. Second, this last 4 or 5 years in particular have been incredibly difficult period because of all of the things that have been going on around the world. But it's important also to recognize that the decade before, more or less, was one where there was also like incredible optimism. Right? I mean, 2015, 16, we're talking about Africa rising, right? And all of the progress that countries were making, there was just no end in sight to that, right? So I think it's also like how we see the context, including the near term, like the next 5 years, etc., sometimes tends to be weighted and influenced by the most recent data point, the most recent period, and so colors what is possible. Again, for me, kind of, the point I would come back to is that, look, over the last 30 years, we have made tremendous progress. And I don't mean like in how the cityscape in Accra has changed, but fundamental progress where there's been incredible improvement in human capital outcomes. Other development indicators, which I always like to look at when I visit countries, things like, infant mortality rates, maternal mortality rates, they've changed faster than in happened than in other faster growing countries around the world. The adoption of technology, it's just phenomenal improvement. And in 1992, if you had asked me if any of this would be possible when I was working for my government or soon after I joined the IMF, I would have been very skeptical. I would have been very skeptical, and look where we are. So going forward, I think what we need to do is, and what, in terms of kind of how we can best position countries, is to realize that a lot of the weakness in macroeconomic outcomes we have seen in recent years have been on account of really terrible external environment, the external shocks that have affected our countries, starting with the pandemic, starting with the war in Ukraine, which had huge, which gave rise to a huge increase in cost of living crisis, the disruption in capital flows, which also increase the cost of financing that our countries are facing. But these are not permanent things. And not only that, but we see a lot of resilience. countries have gone through very difficult patches, but we've calibrated, we've adjusted, and positions ourselves to recover well. So the question for me is like, what do we do now to make sure that we can go back to the Africa Rising years? And I think I see a lot of resilience in the region. I see a lot of hope, and provided policies continue to be in the right direction, we can do even better than we have. Exactly because fundamentals are so much stronger than they were 30 years ago. Lastly, in terms of the role of the IMF, we are, as I said, we have this regular engagement with countries and do tremendous work, as I said, helping strengthen institutions that conduct macroeconomic policy. Like, as I said, revenue authorities, monetary authorities, etc. But it's when crises like this affect the region, affect our countries, that we come to the fore. That's what the world expects of us, and I would argue that we have stepped forward for Africa like never before in our history. Since 2020, March 2020, when the pandemic was declared, we have provided to the tune of about $70 billion in financing for sub-Saharan Africa. That is, multiple times what we used to provide before. And this was needed. Why? Because our countries were facing some of the most difficult period ever, so we've tried to cushion the blow, even as others. Financial markets, donor flows have been declining. We're the ones that have stepped forward, providing all of this financing to cushion the effect of these global shocks. So I think I think we've done.
Well, you can't be a judge in your own court, but what people can say is that because you are very influential in particularly smaller, weaker economies, I'm not saying we can blame you, but you ought to take a bit more responsibility. For example, people talk about debt and how countries were encouraged to go to the international capital markets to accrue debts that, frankly, at some level were very, very unfavorable. And some of that was sort of portrayed as his progress, right? You've built enough buffers to go and borrow from the Eurobond market, for example. Led to debt distress in many countries, and now there's a pushback. Some people feel the fund should take more responsibility and not be more proactive in the way to raise the red flag around those. Because I remember when Setekbe and Ken Ofori-Atta and co were going to the bond market, it sounded like great news. We're on a road show, hey, we are getting nice spreads. It seemed so fun, right? Of course, they took the decisions. But there's a sense in which people feel the fund could have done a bit more to warn of those dangers. Now that things have gone south, of course, so hindsight is clear, right?
No, but you raise a really important and interesting point. How I see my first, I think Kenya was the first country I visited after I was appointed director in 2016, and in a very the visit was really interesting because not only did I meet the country authorities, but also went to parliament, met with civil society organizations, and it gave me kind of really a nice summary shot of what I was seeing in other countries also. So what do I mean by this? So what struck me was that we at the IMF are of course always we're always accused of promoting austerity, always asking countries to reduce the fiscal deficit, and nobody quite relates lower fiscal deficits to the fact that that means lower debt, right? So we tend to be conservative and always tend to see more dangers from loose fiscal policies than perhaps most country authorities. But because that's exactly, we're there to warn about risks. Huh? So I was there making the case for, fiscal restraint. And the minister, also could see the reason for, the case for that. I then went to Parliament, and it was really striking in that the pressure for the government to spend more and to address all of the incredible development needs that we have, to build more universities, more hospitals, more infrastructure, complete the standard gauge railway and extend it to Kampala. I mean, the pressure was just immense. And then, we go to civil society, and civil society organizations were worried about debt also. We're borrowing too much, the debt level has gone up, And what struck me was that, many of our ministers, governments, presidents, our society in general is caught in this something, I called the fiscal trilemma. So, there's pressure to continue to spend. Oh, by the way, the parliamentarians did not see the case for increasing tax revenues. Not at all.
They just wanted more
spending. They just wanted the spending. Okay, and the president, despite the majority in parliament, the minister was facing huge pressure in his inability to increase taxes. So this trilemma, this image that came to me was like, nobody wants tax increases, and civil society was not for tax increases either. Nobody wants tax increases.
Just spend more, don't.
Everybody wants more spending, and nobody wants any debt. Okay, and I wrote up a small piece about that and have been using this framework to discuss issues in countries which were facing this. And I think this is not unique to Africa either, honestly. Okay. I mean, this is in other emerging market countries, but even more so in advanced countries. I mean, you see a lot of the discussions on budget formulation in France or other countries right now. And, so I think what I would argue about, our role in this is that, look, the level of taxation, the composition of spending are deeply domestic and deeply political debates that are to be had within countries. What we do is try and explain kind of, what the pitfalls of perhaps pushing the balance between spending and debt sustainability a bit too much in an aggressive direction could be, etc. And I can assure you that you can call Seth or other ministers, and I don't think that you will find any of them having faced advice from us that the right thing to do is go out and.
But did you warn them?
More.
Did you warn them about the risks in particularly the international capital markets, because that type of funding became available when we became on paper a so-called middle income country.
So this is really important also. I think I also worry a little bit about like all this glitz and excitement that we have about Eurobonds. When the government is issuing domestic bonds.
Nobody does.
We don't raise an eyebrow. And I mean, there's really fundamentally really important reasons, because you're borrowing in your own currency, and by and large, provided you're prudent, that's okay. But every time there's a Eurobond issuance, kind of, all the hype is crazy. So what we do is like we try and take a comprehensive assessment of policies and the financing related to those policies. And so this is exactly where like the work we do on debt sustainability comes in, for example. So I think Ghana, going back as far as 2014 or so, has been categorized as at high risk of debt distress. So we identify the level of debt vulnerability, and we've been flagging that since then. And it's not also policy missteps, though, that led to Ghana being where it is. Although that I would say is, in country after, as you zoom out and think about why it is debt difficulties have arisen. In some cases, it's policies, but external environment and the change in external environment has also contributed. There's nobody out there that will tell you that. The IMF has been for going out and borrowing. If anything, we've been making the case the other way around. But fundamentally, at the end of the day, the decisions, of course, are fundamentally sovereign decisions.
We're speaking to the Director of the Africa Department for the IMF, Abebe Aemro Selassie, and we're reflecting on a number of things. When we come back, we'll talk a bit more about the Ghana situation. We have, of course, just had the 5th review of our extended credit facility. Almost all the $3 billion has been given to us. What's the outlook for that, right? And what are its own reflections on how economic policy management should work going forward, having worked for the fund for many, many years. This is the point of view. Stay with us.
What does it take to be Ghana's most useful technology company? Is it the fact that we've been connecting businesses to their customers for over 20 years? Or that we power more than 12% of all electronic transactions in Ghana? Maybe it's that we are everywhere, from Accra to Ho, Kumasi to Tadi, Cape Coast to Tamale. Or is it that we safely process more transactions than any indigenous tech company here in Ghana? Or we deliver faster, we transfer safer, or we make businesses and life just a little easier? But what truly makes us Ghana's most useful technology company, it isn't the speed or the numbers. It's the people we connect, the dreams we keep moving, the communities we bring closer every single day. You prove every day what usefulness really looks like. We give you the tools, you provide the proof. Haptel, useful every day.
Welcome back. Tonight we're privileged to be talking to the Director of the Africa Department of the IMF, Abebe Aemro Selassie, and reflecting on his many years at the fund and also where Ghana is. So thanks for staying with us. Ghana is at the closing ends of their, is it their 18th program? I'm not even sure now. 17th program. And the reviews seem satisfactorily positive. But as a journalist, I'll say we've been here before. So you come to the end of one cycle, a new government has done 1 year, and generally things are okay. But it's almost the pre-election year, the election year, things go south. A lot of people are frustrated that we keep going back. So the programs are like palliatives. They're not really structurally mending the problems, all right? So whilst the review seems fairly positive, how should Ghanaians interpret that over the past 17 programs? Right, not just on this, because we know that this is a great start. How should we interpret this great start, having in mind the fact that we've been here 17 times before?
So, I think the first thing to note is I go back a little bit, maybe a bit too much in looking at, if you look at the broad sweep of time, there has been tremendous progress in Ghana. Okay, and this is not on account of IMF or these programs, but what the Ghanaian people, government, civil society, parliament, businesses have done, and that's going forward. Also, that's what Ghana's continued success will rely on. Second, I think policy making in the context of boisterous democracies that our countries are increasingly becoming is not easy, yeah? And quite challenging. Yeah? And when I look at Ghana's record, the weakness, there's been tremendous strength in terms of the improvement and development outcomes. Indicators like electricity access. It used to be 30-40% 20 years ago. Now it's closer to 90% or even more. Yeah? So there's been tremendous progress in the quality of life in many cases. Where there hasn't been as much progress, if you ask me, is job creation, one, and then second one I think is the volatility in macroeconomic indicators, generally around the electoral cycle. So I think fundamentally going forward, how Ghana can reduce reliance on external financing, periodic external financing from the IMF, World Bank, that you rely on, is by trying to address these two areas in a durable way, in a lasting way. So I think fundamentally, again, this goes back to the points I was raising earlier. I think as countries we have to look at, Ghana has very strong social contract, incredibly boisterous democracy. Why is it that when the government is providing all of these goods and services, there isn't enough attention being paid to tax revenue collection, for example? These are deeply domestic, these deeply internal questions. And the Achilles heel here, honestly, I think has been that there's been the periods where there hasn't been external financing, external concessional financing, instead the reliance has been on expensive debt rather than on tax revenues. And as long as fiscal deficits keep blowing up and concessional financing aid is not replaced by revenue but rather by borrowing, then the risk of more macroeconomic instability will always be there. And this is not unique to Ghana. It's also we see something that's been happening in other emerging market countries, and those countries that have reduced recourse to concessional financing, reduced volatility, which is harmful to growth, which is harmful to employment, have done two things, honestly. One is kept fiscal deficits reasonably contained, and the second one have avoided pegging the exchange rate and instead allowed the exchange rate to be a really important
managed float.
The exchange rate in general, they've allowed it to be an important shock absorber.
Okay.
So if there's one thing, and the lion's share of my career at the IMF, I was working with emerging market countries, advanced countries, and in the 90s, the countries that were early in my career that I was working on are the Thailands of this world, Romania, other countries like that. And those countries have reduced reliance on the IMF. The same with Latin America, Brazil and others. Even India had a program with the IMF in 1990, 91. And what is it that those countries have done that they no longer have to rely on external financing like that of the IMF? These two things that I mentioned. Kept fiscal deficits to a generally manageable level, debt levels to a manageable level, and second, they have allowed the exchange rate to be flexible and move to absorb shocks. So they're not defending unsustainable exchange rates, not drawing down reserves and leading to periodic effects.
So let me just understand that second point. Are you saying that they do not intervene at all, or they are more scientific about how they do it?
So it's a bit technical, but so on the exchange rate, what tends to happen in many of our countries is that, particularly in Africa, there is this tremendous urban bias, tremendous regressive focus. Regressive because we look at the interest of generally, richer people who have higher import content baskets. We see the exchange rate as the metric of how well an economy is doing, and understandably, because you don't have many other prices in the economy to signal how well the economy is doing, to provide signaling to businesses in terms of how they ought to be investing. But the exchange rate is a price, and sometimes when it's not reflecting fundamentals, what happens is that you invest so much focus and interest in keeping it pegged, you lose reserves, you keep it at an unsustainable level, reducing competitiveness and economic output, and that has also been an important driver of crisis in countries. So. This shift that countries around the world have made towards an inflation targeting regime, where they emphasize the inflation rate as an anchor for signaling about economic conditions, has been a really important one, and one where I don't think there's been sufficient transition in our region. There are some countries which have done it really well. I think South Africa, exemplary focus on inflation targeting, allowing the exchange rate to move. Ghana has also made tremendous progress. Uganda has made tremendous progress. In Ghana, this has been in fits and starts. So that also is, I think, an area which our countries in the region would need to work on.
So I'm staying with the Bank of Ghana now because a big controversy has arisen around its domestic gold purchase program, the role of the gold board, and how cautious the fund is around the whole management of FX. So I think you want more transparency, and there appears to be some concern around aggressive intervention. So I just want you to explain what the fund's apprehensions are, because the way it's been debated, it's almost political, right? But the view from a street person is that the gold board has come in, it buys gold from artisanal miners. The Bank of Ghana has continued with this gold purchase program. It's built its reserves and uses some of that to support the currency. I just want to understand what's the issue here.
So just to be very clear, the team on Ghana can provide you with a lot more detail on this. But in general, what is, ideally, what you want central banks to be focusing on is on their core mandate, which is making sure that the economy is broadly stable, and in particular, inflation is stable, and from that to low and contained and predictable, so that you don't see the erosion in the living standards that we saw when inflation was 40-50%, right? That is by far the most important contribution that central banks can make. And from that will come about a lot more stability, predictability, and exchange rate, economic conditions, reduced uncertainty. In our region, of course, because fiscal situation tends to be a difficult one, there's historically been a lot of pressure for central banks to provide financing directly to the government or indirectly, or engage in some operations, and the various operations have been very country specific. So I think the broad message and the broad learning from the experience of other countries is that central banks do best when they're focused on their core mandate. Okay. Yes, there are of course other issues, like in Ghana. I know for many years this issue of artisanal mining has been really, a source of quite a lot of discussion, controversy, and you have conjunctures like the current one when gold prices are going up sharply, when you feel like, and because gold of course exports, how the country gets control of those gold resources is also something for debate, and absolutely legitimate and important debate. Why shouldn't Ghana be benefiting more from this important resource? But I would say just it's really important that if you are going to be tasking the central bank to do this, lay out very carefully what is a fiscal operation, if you will, versus what is a monetary operation. So just thinking very carefully and avoiding the central bank balance sheet being used as to build contingent liabilities.
I understand that.
These are the points I think that are under discussion. And again, you have really very strong institutions in Ghana.
Let me just understand the inflation point though. There are a couple of people who feel inflation targeting is great, but it's not really sufficient as a sort of overall measure of economic progress. I've heard economists even say we should also, in addition to that, do employment targeting. That's number one. Number two, while inflation is the broad level of prices, people feel interest rates is the price of credit. Exchange rate is the price of FX. So the BOG or the BON or BO, whatever, whichever bank it is, must interpret its price stabilization role to include not just the price of goods and services, but the price of credit and the price of FX, which is why sometimes they get involved in these, what you call quasi-fiscal operations. I just want your general thoughts around, because in a country like Ghana, which is import dependent, the price of FX is a very big issue.
Okay, so let's start with probably the most important variable here, which is employment, and
yes.
Particularly youth job creation for our countries. We are a region where we have tremendous demographic pressures, a lot of young people coming into the labor force every year, so we need a lot more economic growth, a business environment that's conducive to more labor-intensive development. And I would argue that these are areas of responsibility, areas of focus, where policies need to be developed by institutions other than the central bank, because it's very difficult to know how a central bank can directly influence employment creation, because employment creation happens in the private sector for the most part, and so that really should be, of course, an important metric of success in our economies when we talk about it. So that's my answer on the employment part.
Yes.
Now, coming to the central bank and why perhaps the focus on inflation should dominate over the others.
Yeah.
So what I would argue is that, look, if you look at interest rate, the cost of money, it's often related to what the inflation rate is and then some markup. If inflation is high, okay, the cost of the interest rate is always going to be high.
Yes.
Okay, and if you have interest rates that are what we would call negative in real terms, that of course basically feeds into higher and higher inflation. Right? So again, even if you want low cost of borrowing so that enterprises can borrow more and invest more, households can borrow more so that you can afford longer term commitments like mortgages or car payments, that all needs really low inflation to help lower interest rates. On the exchange rate, the exchange rate is an asset price. It's part determined by supply and demand domestically, but it's also determined by a lot of other things on which the country has limited control.
Yes.
There are periods, for example, when the dollar would strengthen, as we saw in recent years, because of things nothing inherently to do with the fundamentals in the Ghanaian economy. If you're pursuing a peg in a context like Ghana to stop your exchange rate weakening, does that make sense? Okay, so this is why kind of an anchor, when it's concerned about the domestic economic situation that's focused on inflation, dominates an anchor that's focused on the interest rate or other variables. Now, of course, there are other countries that have an exchange rate that's pegged to the euro or the dollar as the part of their monetary framework, but that's not the framework that you have here. If you choose to have a framework where that is the case, then you're giving up control on monetary policy completely. Right. So that gives rise to a whole set of different questions. So if you look next door, Cote d'Ivoire is part of the zone franc, and they have their currency pegged to the euro, right? And they've always historically had a very, very low inflation rate, but they've lost monetary policy independence, right? They don't have you see the point.
I see the point.
But I think in the framework here that Ghana has adopted, we think that, and I think it's not just we, I mean, this BOG, most importantly, thinks that a regime where the focus is on inflation is important.
For time's sake, I'm going to do a 2-in-1.
Yeah.
The debt situation assessment remains high risk of debt distress. Now, the reasons given are uncertainty surrounding commodity price, exchange rate movement, and then elevated rollover of IPP. I just wanted your thoughts around commodity price, because cocoa and gold are very key for the country. Gold, unprecedented levels. Some people think it's going to even get to 5,000 per ounce. It's about 4,700. Cocoa has also done relatively well. If I were the finance minister, I would be a bit disappointed that the assessment of our debt rate remains high, because we made some progress. Bilateral agreements have been done, some payments have been made, how to even treat some debts have been agreed.
Yeah.
So some people feel, aren't you being a bit too conservative overall around our debt outlook, looking at how well commodity prices are trending, and then also some of the progress we are seeing in the energy sector in relation to payments as well. So I just want you to sort of mix all of those up in how you understand the debt as analysis in view of the energy sector and the commodity price, because those are the two main areas of sustaining our mobilization of revenue.
So, when we do the sustainability analysis, it is by looking at, the whole, a whole panoply of indicators, a lot of indicators. And we try and identify the factors that can have predominant weight. And it's interesting that you say that commodity prices are high and could go higher still. It wasn't so long ago when, I remember having a lot of conversations like this with officials in the context of the pandemic, when we were looking at some countries that are oil exporters, and oil prices had fallen to 35 a barrel. They felt hard done by, and then a year later, when the war broke out in when Soviet Union invaded, when Russia invaded Ukraine,
everything,
showing how old I am. Russia invaded Ukraine.
Soviet Union.
when Russia invaded Ukraine and
Yeah.
oil prices went up, everybody wanted oil, for us to use $100
Yeah.
as an oil price.
Yeah.
And yes, gold prices are where they are, but I think being conservative in what we assume about these commodity prices are important for two reasons. One, they tend to be very volatile. And the second, perhaps more fundamental reason is, at least in my working career, but I think even beyond, one of the great ambitions that we've had as countries has been diversification beyond just reliance on natural resources. One of the reasons why we tend to get into not achieve this objective is because we tend to overly rely on commodity revenues. And so our advice to countries generally is that to assume a conservative price for those revenues when you're doing your macroeconomic projections, so it doesn't lead to volatility in spending. And if the result is that you end up overperforming on fiscal front, important to save that for investments down the road rather than calibrate policies and pursue policies where you use all of that borrowing room.
Let me end on a personal note. So now that you will be leaving the fund after 32 years, I mean, what would you do with the rest of your life? I ask this because a lot of people, when they leave active service, like Obasanjo now, he's helping Mahama with the Accra reset. Ellen Johnson Sirleaf is also part of this, right? I mean, you are from Ethiopia. Your name is Selassie, so you even sound like a Ghanaian, right?
Do you have a job for me here?
I'm just wondering, are you contemplating any sort of Pan-African, because your experience is incredible, right?
Yeah.
And the continent is also looking for a new sort of alliance where we're trying to build something that works for us. And with the kind of experience you have, what would be the ideal post-IMF thinking for you?
So, look, first, I'm moving on because I've been in this job for 10 years, and it's been an incredible privilege to be able to have the opportunity to work with, so many countries, so many great leaders, incredible policymakers, interacting with people around the region. I mean, just cannot think of I would never have dreamt of this, and it's been a great privilege. And so, having done it for 10 years, I think I also feel like time to go do something else. And my family circumstances are also such that kids are out of the house to university, etc. So, if it would allow me to come back to the region in some form or fashion. Second, as to what I will continue to do, I mean, it's a great honor to be, to have my name kind of associated with these great people. But I will continue. My passion has always been economics, development issues, and above all serving our people, and I will do whatever I can in whatever capacity to do that, particularly in the policy area. And my focus, and I get excited about these more technical type of issues. So I want to do some academic work around that, and help as much as I can around the region.
We look forward to hearing from you more.
Thank you. Hopefully.
Yes, we've been talking to he's not finished his work. He has at least 4 or 5 months to work, and there's a lot of work to be done. So I hope I didn't create the impression that it was done. We are in January, and 4 months is a long time.
Absolutely.
In the work you do, but we appreciate what you do, and we thank you for talking to us here on The Point of View. We've been speaking to the Director of the Africa Department of the IMF, Abebe Aemro Selassie, who's in Ghana for some important work, and we caught up with him reflecting on the global economy, Africa, Ghana, and the rest of it. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.